The police officers laughed at the black woman dressed like a homeless person in court. They didn't just laugh, they mocked her, tore her dignity apart like it was a joke passed around in a break room. "What kind of justice lets this happen?" One of them leaned toward another and muttered with a smirk, "Look what the streets dragged in. Probably doesn't even know what a toothbrush looks like." Another officer chuckled. "She's going to ask the judge for a sandwich instead of a lawyer." They weren't whispering. They wanted her to hear, to feel the weight of their disdain. And she did. She sat there, silent, head bowed, her coat ragged, fingers wrapped around the fabric like it was her only armor. Her face, partially hidden beneath a tangled mass of hair and a layer of dirt, didn't move. She didn't cry. She didn't flinch. But what if she wasn't who they thought she was? No one in that courtroom realized, not the judge, not the public defender who barely glanced at her case file, not the officers who had dragged her off the streets 2 nights earlier, that this wasn't the first time she'd sat in a courtroom. Only this time, she wasn't here to be judged. She was here to expose judgment itself. She had walked into that courthouse like a ghost from society's blind spot, unseen, unheard, unwanted. Every eye that fell on her saw nothing more than a problem to be processed and pushed away. But this wasn't a mistake. She had chosen this disguise. She had studied every expression of contempt, every dismissive gesture, every lazy assumption. And now, wrapped in the very image they hated, she was here to confront it all. Months earlier, she had received an anonymous tip, one that led to a chain of complaints ignored by internal affairs, covered-up body cam footage, and reports that vanished into thin air. Something was happening inside this police department. Something systemic, something ugly, and she wasn't about to walk away from it. But the plan required her to disappear from who she was, to become someone the system didn't value, someone these officers wouldn't even consider a threat. And they played right into her hands. From the moment they spotted her loitering outside a grocery store, pushing an empty cart, digging through a trash bin, they already decided she was guilty of something. They didn't ask questions. They didn't give warnings. They grabbed her, laughed, shoved her into the back of a patrol car, and booked her for trespassing and resisting arrest. The charges were thin, but it didn't matter. In their eyes, she was already trash. She heard one of them say, "It's always the same damn story with these people." That phrase repeated itself in her head for hours as she sat in a holding cell, made for 10, but packed with 23. Not a single officer stopped to ask if she needed medical attention, if she'd eaten. No one thought she mattered enough to care. Now she sat in court, waiting to be processed like hundreds before her quickly, quietly, without resistance. But as she sat there, the officers stood against the wall, smirks plastered across their faces, arms crossed, satisfied. She was the punchline to a joke they'd been telling their entire careers. The judge barely looked up. The public defender scrolled his phone under the table. And yet, she said nothing, because the truth was, everything was going exactly as planned. What they didn't know was that the case wasn't real. What they didn't know was that their badge numbers had already been flagged. What they didn't know was that this woman they had dragged in for show, the one they joked about smelling like the gutter, had spent the last 8 months collecting testimonies, footage, and data that tied at least 5 of them to misconduct, abuse of power, and civil rights violations. What they didn't know was that the people watching the courtroom feed from an unmarked van down the street weren't journalists. They were federal agents. What they didn't know was that the courtroom had become a trap and they had walked straight into it. But this story is not about revenge. It's about justice in disguise. It's about how deep the roots of prejudice run and how invisible the truth becomes when it doesn't look the way people expect it to. It's about a woman who was willing to be humiliated, spit on, degraded, just to make sure the system couldn't keep hiding behind polished uniforms and fake smiles. She gave up her name, her comfort, her safety, all for one moment. One undeniable, inescapable moment, because what happened next wasn't part of the court schedule. It wasn't on the docket. But it changed everything. Imagine a courtroom frozen in place, officers' faces draining of color, a judge speechless, cameras rolling, lives unraveling in real time. One woman standing up, not as a defendant, but as the one in control of the entire operation. She wasn't there to plead guilty. She was there to take them all down. But how did she do it, and why did it leave the entire city talking for months afterward? Stay until the end of this story, because what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought about justice, power, and appearances. Before we start this story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to every Black viewer watching this video. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism, injustice, and discrimination. This channel is a space that uplifts truth, dignity, and the power of turning pain into purpose. If you've ever been judged by your skin before your soul, this story is for you. And remember, your worth isn't up for debate. Enjoy this powerful twist, and don't forget to subscribe to Plow of Twist for more stories that move, shock, and inspire. In the heart of Baltimore, where row houses stretch in tightly packed blocks and the streets breathe stories of both struggle and pride, there lived a woman who most people never noticed, unless they had to. Not because she didn't stand out, in fact, she did, profoundly, but because she moved like someone who had learned to exist without being seen. Her name was Danielle Brooks, and for most of her life, she had been the kind of woman people underestimated, until it was too late to undo the mistake. Danielle was tall, with skin the color of polished mahogany, and eyes that carried a quiet fire that never went out, not even when it was hidden behind a look of indifference or calm. She walked like she'd been through storms and survived them all. And when she spoke, her voice came low and deliberate, like every word was chosen with care. To those who knew her, truly knew her, she was resilience personified. But very few people could say they really did. Born and raised in the west side of the city, Danielle had seen Baltimore through every lens. The lens of a child walking to school in worn sneakers, the lens of a teenager navigating corners she had no business being on, and later, the lens of a law student at Morgan State University. Determined to make something more of herself than what the statistics predicted. Her mother, Clarice, had worked 2 jobs most of Danielle's childhood, janitor by day, caregiver by night, and still managed to keep food on the table and rules in the house. Her father, a former mechanic, had been out of the picture since she was 10, but his absence had taught her the value of presence in ways he never could. Danielle's journey into law enforcement hadn't been inspired by justice shows or courtroom dramas. It was rooted in something far deeper and more painful. A quiet rage she carried ever since her older brother, Jalan, had been stopped one night on his way home from work, accused of loitering, and ended up beaten so badly he spent 3 weeks in the hospital. The officers involved claimed he resisted arrest. The city claimed it was an unfortunate escalation. Danielle knew it was neither. And though the charges against her brother were dropped, nothing happened to the officers. No suspensions, no inquiries, just another young Black man brutalized and forgotten. That night changed her. It lit something in her that law school alone couldn't satisfy. It was why, after graduation, she turned down the corporate firms and the polished marble offices and instead joined the FBI. Not for the badge, not for the status, but for the chance to change something from the inside, no matter how long it took. Years passed. Danielle rose through the ranks, slowly, strategically. She was smart enough to know when to speak and when to listen, when to show her strength and when to hide it beneath silence. Her work focused on internal corruption and abuse of power, cases often buried deep inside systems protected by politics, race, and legacy. It was slow, often thankless work, and sometimes left her more frustrated than fulfilled. But every case she took brought her closer to something that felt like justice. It was during one of those cases, a follow-up on a whistleblower complaint from within the Baltimore Police Department, that she stumbled across a pattern she couldn't ignore. Minor infractions leading to excessive force. Reports of intimidation and silence among new recruits. Body cam footage edited or conveniently missing. And at the center of it, a handful of names that kept reappearing, all officers working in the same West Precinct where her brother had once been brutalized. The city had changed, but not enough. And Danielle knew this case would be different. It would take more than paperwork. Appearances. Before we start the story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to every Black viewer watching this video. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism, injustice, and discrimination. This channel is a space that uplifts truth, dignity, and the power of turning pain into purpose. If you've ever been judged by your skin before your soul, this story is for you. And remember, your worth isn't up for debate. Enjoy this powerful twist, and don't forget to subscribe to Plow of Twist for more stories that move, shock, and inspire. In the heart of Baltimore, where row houses stretch in tightly packed blocks and the streets breathe stories of both struggle and pride, there lived a woman who most people never noticed, unless they had to. Not because she didn't stand out, in fact, she did, profoundly, but because she moved like someone who had learned to exist without being seen. Her name was Danielle Brooks, and for most of her life, she had been the kind of woman people underestimated, until it was too late to undo the mistake. Danielle was tall, with skin the color of polished mahogany, and eyes that carried a quiet fire that never went out, not even when it was hidden behind a look of indifference or calm. She walked like she'd been through storms and survived them all. And when she spoke, her voice came low and deliberate, like every word was chosen with care. To those who knew her, truly knew her, she was resilience personified. But very few people could say they really did. Born and raised in the west side of the city, Danielle had seen Baltimore through every lens. The lens of a child walking to school in worn sneakers, the lens of a teenager navigating corners she had no business being on, and later, the lens of a law student at Morgan State University. Determined to make something more of herself than what the statistics predicted. Her mother, Clarice, had worked 2 jobs most of Danielle's childhood, janitor by day, caregiver by night, and still managed to keep food on the table and rules in the house. Her father, a former mechanic, had been out of the picture since she was 10, but his absence had taught her the value of presence in ways he never could. Danielle's journey into law enforcement hadn't been inspired by justice shows or courtroom dramas. It was rooted in something far deeper and more painful. A quiet rage she carried ever since her older brother, Jalan, had been stopped one night on his way home from work, accused of loitering, and ended up beaten so badly he spent 3 weeks in the hospital. The officers involved claimed he resisted arrest. The city claimed it was an unfortunate escalation. Danielle knew it was neither. And though the charges against her brother were dropped, nothing happened to the officers. No suspensions, no inquiries, just another young Black man brutalized and forgotten. That night changed her. It lit something in her that law school alone couldn't satisfy. It was why, after graduation, she turned down the corporate firms and the polished marble offices and instead joined the FBI. Not for the badge, not for the status, but for the chance to change something from the inside, no matter how long it took. Years passed. Danielle rose through the ranks, slowly, strategically. She was smart enough to know when to speak and when to listen, when to show her strength and when to hide it beneath silence. Her work focused on internal corruption and abuse of power, cases often buried deep inside systems protected by politics, race, and legacy. It was slow, often thankless work, and sometimes left her more frustrated than fulfilled. But every case she took brought her closer to something that felt like justice. It was during one of those cases, a follow-up on a whistleblower complaint from within the Baltimore Police Department, that she stumbled across a pattern she couldn't ignore. Minor infractions leading to excessive force. Reports of intimidation and silence among new recruits. Body cam footage edited or conveniently missing. And at the center of it, a handful of names that kept reappearing, all officers working in the same West Precinct where her brother had once been brutalized. The city had changed, but not enough. And Danielle knew this case would be different. It would take more than paperwork and quiet inquiries. The stories weren't being told on paper. They were buried in interactions that no one recorded, buried in fear and silence. She had seen this kind of darkness before. The kind that hid behind protocol and policy, behind grins and badges, the kind that couldn't be exposed from the outside. That's when the idea began to take shape. Disguises weren't foreign to Danielle. Undercover work was part of her past, though rare, reserved for moments when no other method would work. This time, she would go further than ever before. She wouldn't just pose as someone else. She would live it. She would vanish from her role, go completely dark, take a leave that few would question, and reemerge on the streets, unrecognizable, forgotten, just another shadow in a city full of them. And so, Danielle Brooks, respected agent, relentless investigator, became invisible. She chose her new identity carefully, layers of clothes that didn't match, a coat torn at the seams, hair matted and tucked beneath an old knit cap, fingernails left dirty, skin dusted with grime. A cheap blanket always wrapped around her shoulders as if she was clinging to the last warmth of a forgotten world. She moved around the city like a ghost, sleeping under bridges, sitting on corners, walking alleys, collecting pieces of conversations, watching patterns. People ignored her. Shop owners shooed her away. Police officers passed her like she was part of the pavement, but she was always listening, always watching. Then came the night that changed everything. She was resting beside an old grocery store dumpster when 2 squad cars pulled up. She didn't flinch. She had rehearsed this moment. The call had been made anonymously, a suspicious vagrant spotted near the store's back entrance. Within minutes, flashlights hit her face, commands barked, hands yanked her up with no hesitation. The moment she locked eyes with the officers, something in their posture said this wasn't about enforcing the law. This was about dominance. She didn't resist. She didn't speak. That was part of the plan. Let them see what they wanted to see. They pushed her into the back seat like she was trash. One officer laughed, saying he'd probably catch fleas now. Another muttered, "She's lucky we don't wash the streets with fire hoses like back in the day." She stared at the city lights flashing through the cage between them, thinking how easy it had been for them to strip her of humanity without knowing a single thing about her. The holding cell was cold, smelled like piss and bleach. No one offered her food. A single nurse asked if she was mentally fit to stand trial, barely looking her in the eye. The next morning, she was given no phone call, no explanation, just escorted into a courtroom like a spectacle for amusement. That's where it happened. The courtroom wasn't full, but the eyes that were there drilled into her. A judge who barely looked up, a public defender who sighed as he flipped through her file like he was already exhausted by her existence, and the officers who brought her in, standing off to the side, arms crossed, smirking. They made comments loud enough to carry, laughs that echoed off the marble walls. One leaned over to another and said that she doesn't even remember her name. They all laughed. Danielle didn't move. Not because she was scared, but because she was collecting. Every sound, every insult, every glance, it was all being recorded, not just in her mind, but by the hidden mic stitched into the seams of her coat. They had no idea that every breath they exhaled in arrogance was being documented. They had no idea they had already walked into her investigation and that their laughter was about to become Exhibit A. But for now, she stayed quiet. She let the courtroom play out exactly as they expected. She let them write the script they had written for so many before her. Because soon, the narrative would flip and none of them were ready. The courtroom's fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as Danielle remained still, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed not on the judge or the public defender, but slightly downward, as if avoiding eye contact with a world that had already made its judgment. The room carried the cold hum of routine, a place where stories like hers were processed, not heard. One by one, people passed through, shackled to narratives written by others, expected to plead, to nod, to disappear. Her file was thin, intentionally vague, designed to attract minimal attention. But what the file lacked in depth, the room made up for in assumptions. Her silence, her posture, her appearance, all of it told the story they wanted to believe. And every second she stayed in that seat, every second she endured the snide glances and the suppressed chuckles, she added another brick to the wall she would soon collapse. Danielle could feel the eyes of Officer Daniels on her, a man whose name had surfaced too many times in complaints that mysteriously went nowhere. He stood with an air of arrogance that had clearly been earned by years of unchallenged authority. Next to him, Officer Meeks leaned against the back wall, arms crossed, chewing gum as if this was all an afternoon game. She overheard him say to the officer beside him, "You'd think she'd at least pretend to have some dignity. Look at her. Bet she smells like the inside of a sewer." The man next to him laughed, but tried to hide it behind a cough. The judge looked up briefly, said nothing, and moved on. The public defender assigned to her didn't even introduce himself until moments before the hearing began. He slid into the seat beside her, shuffled through a few papers, and without looking at her, muttered, "Trespassing and resisting arrest. First offense, probably. I'll try to get you a deferred judgment, maybe some community service." Danielle didn't respond. He looked at her then, impatiently. "Do you understand what I'm saying? You just have to say, 'Yes, Your Honor,' and we'll be done here." She turned to him slowly and met his eyes, and for the first time he paused. Something in her gaze, the clarity, the control, didn't fit the story. But he shook it off and went back to his paperwork, brushing it off as luck or pride or maybe just illusion. The judge called her name. She didn't flinch. The public defender stood and began to speak, his voice droning with formality. But before he could finish, the judge interrupted, "Let's make this quick. We've got a full docket today." Danielle remained seated. It wasn't time yet. She could feel the moment approaching, like a train rumbling down the tracks, still distant but impossible to stop. After court adjourned, she was escorted back to the holding area, her wrists lightly cuffed, a protocol for the sake of appearances. Officer Daniels walked beside her, speaking low enough that no one else could hear. "You people never learn. Always think the rules don't apply to you. Maybe a night in jail will remind you what your place is." She didn't answer. Her silence was a blade, and she knew he could feel its edge even if he didn't understand it. Later that night, inside the cell, Danielle laid down on the hard bench, her body aching from days of sleeping rough. Her mind, however, was alert. She went over the timeline again. The micro camera embedded in her coat had captured everything: the comments, the behavior, the lack of legal counsel, the dismissive attitudes. Tomorrow, she'd appear again, and the next day. Each appearance was another layer added to the case she was building. A case not just against a few rogue officers, but against an entire culture within the precinct that had been allowed to fester without consequence. Back at the Bureau's mobile command center, parked miles away, her handler, Special Agent Moreno, monitored the live feed, his fingers typing out transcriptions, annotations, time-stamped notes. The operation, codenamed Ghostwatch, had been approved at the highest level. But only a few inside the agency knew Danielle was undercover. The stakes were too high, the exposure too sensitive. One mistake, one wrong word, and the entire mission would crumble. Worse, Danielle would be left hanging in a system designed to discard people like the one she was pretending to be. The following day, during her second court appearance, the same officers were present. This time, Daniels leaned against the courtroom wall with an amused grin, his phone held casually in his hand as he filmed her. "Got to show the boys this later," he whispered. "She looks even worse today." Meeks laughed and muttered something Danielle couldn't make out, but she didn't need to. The tone was enough. The judge, once again, rushed through the process, visibly annoyed by her silence, her refusal to play the part of the ashamed defendant. The public defender sighed audibly as he left the bench. "You know, if you just cooperate, this would all be over," he told her in the hallway. "Whatever chip you've got on your shoulder, it's not going to change anything." She didn't answer him either. She didn't need to. Each word, each exchange, was being stored, streamed, archived. She wasn't just gathering evidence. She was gathering truth, the kind you couldn't scrub from a report. 2 days later, a woman named Trina, a real unhoused woman Danielle had met during her first week on the street, was dragged into court in the exact same way. Her arm was bruised, her eyes swollen. Danielle watched from her seat in the back as Trina stood, trembling, before the judge, unable to articulate what had happened to her. Her court-appointed attorney didn't seem to care. And once again, Danielle stood in the back, smug, detached, unbothered. That night, Danielle sat beside Trina in the holding cell. "They beat you," she said softly. Trina nodded, tears welling up. "Said I was talking too much. Said I needed to learn to shut my mouth." Danielle placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "They will answer for it. I promise." That promise wasn't empty. The file was growing thicker by the hour. Audio, video, interviews, documented violations, breaches of protocol. The Department of Justice had already been looped in. If things went according to plan, the next court session would be the last they'd have to fake. Everything was in motion. But Danielle felt the weight of what was to come pressing down on her chest, like a storm about to break. The night before the final session, she received a message, coded, embedded in a news clip sent to a burner phone she'd hidden in a drain pipe outside the shelter. Asterisk operation greenlit. Strike window confirmed. Execute phase 3. Asterisk, that was all it said, but it was enough. Inside the precinct that night, officers joked about her again. "You see her sitting there like a broken dog?" Daniel said, his voice echoing through the hallway. "Next time, I'll bring a muzzle. Bet she bites." Meeks chuckled. "She don't bite. She barely breathes. Trash like her? They don't fight. They just rot." Danielle was in the next room, close enough to hear every word. She didn't sleep that night. She didn't eat. She sat upright, back against the wall, her eyes wide open in the dark. Not from fear, but from focus. She thought of her mother, of her brother, of every person who had stood in a courtroom just like hers, invisible in the eyes of those with power. She thought of Trina. She thought of all the voices silenced, not because they were wrong, but because they weren't believed. Tomorrow, those voices would speak through her, through everything she had endured. And as dawn crept through the thin slit of a window high on the cell wall, she closed her eyes for just a second and whispered to herself, "They think they've won." But what they didn't know, what they could never have guessed, was that by laughing at her, they had opened the door to their own collapse. And now all that was left was to let the truth walk in. Courtroom 2B wasn't any different from the others in the building. But that morning, the air inside felt denser, heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The benches filled slowly with the usual crowd, court officers, a few sleepy lawyers, a small gathering of people waiting for unrelated cases. The judge took her place as casually as she had all week, shuffling papers and checking her docket without looking up. Daniels and Meeks leaned casually against the back wall, just as they always did, already smirking at the sight of Danielle being led in, her shoulders hunched beneath her tattered coat. The shackles clinked faintly with every step she took, and she moved as if her body weighed more than it had the day before. But her eyes, hidden beneath tangled hair, scanned the room with precision. She wasn't watching the judge. She wasn't watching the officers. She was watching the door. The public defender, same one from earlier in the week, didn't bother sitting down right away. He leaned against the table, flipping through the same file he'd barely touched. "Trespassing, resisting," he muttered, then glanced at her. Same deal today. You just need to speak this time. One word, and we're out of here. Danielle lifted her head slowly, her eyes meeting his with a stillness that unnerved him. She didn't speak, but the way she looked at him, it was like watching a storm form behind a pane of glass. The judge cleared her throat and tapped her pen twice on the wooden bench. Let's move this along. We've got a full list today. She looked down at the paperwork, then directly at Danielle. Miss Brooks, this is your third court appearance. You've refused to speak or accept counsel. Do you understand the charges against you? There was silence. The public defender leaned in, exasperated. Come on, just say yes. Danielle slowly stood upright. She didn't answer the judge. Instead, she turned toward the gallery, toward the officers, and then toward the door. At that exact moment, it opened. Two men entered, suits clean-cut, no badges displayed, but they didn't need to announce themselves. The way they moved, the way the guards stiffened at their presence, it was clear. Federal. One of them carried a leather briefcase. The other had a thick folder in his hands. They didn't take seats. They stood near the center aisle, calm, waiting. Daniel straightened slightly, glancing at Meeks, who had stopped chewing his gum. The judge's voice lost its rhythm. Can I help you, gentlemen? The man with the folder stepped forward. Yes, Your Honor. We're here in reference to this case. What's the Department of Justice doing involved in a loitering charge? The judge asked, half joking, half wary. The man placed the folder on the clerk's desk, opening it slowly. Because this isn't a loitering case. And the defendant, he paused, turning to Danielle, is not who you think she is. The room shifted. The tension wasn't sudden. It was slow, like cold water creeping under the skin. The judge blinked, unsure if this was real. Excuse me. Danielle's hands moved to the front of her coat. Her fingers, steady, calm, unclasped a hidden fastener. From beneath a fold of lining, she pulled a black wallet. She opened it slowly, deliberately. Inside, the gold badge of a federal agent gleamed under the courtroom lights. I'm Special Agent Danielle Brooks, FBI. The silence that followed felt physical. It wasn't disbelief. It was something deeper, a cognitive rupture, the realization that every assumption, every smirk, every word had been built on a lie. Danielle stepped forward, removing the coat entirely. Underneath, she wore a clean, plain black blouse. Her posture straightened, like a spine unfolding after weeks of compression. I have spent the past 47 days embedded in the streets of Baltimore as part of an undercover operation authorized by the Department of Justice, she said, her voice cutting through the room. I have documented over a dozen incidents of misconduct, abuse of power, and systemic failure, including what occurred inside this very courtroom. Daniel's face had gone pale. Meeks had taken one step back. The federal agent with the briefcase approached the bench. Your Honor, we are submitting a motion to dismiss all charges against Special Agent Brooks and enter into the record a federal investigation into Officers Daniels, Meeks, and several others within the West Precinct. Daniels took a step forward, his voice shaky, defensive. This is a mistake. She's lying. She assaulted an officer. Danielle turned toward him, her expression unreadable. You want to talk about assault, Officer Daniels? Would you like us to play the audio from the patrol car 2 nights ago, the part where you threatened to break my ribs for not moving fast enough? Or maybe the footage from Trina Harris's arrest, the one where she was handcuffed, and you still shoved her face first into the squad car. Daniel's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Meeks mumbled, "This is insane." She set us up. Danielle walked toward them, slow, steady, her voice unwavering. No, you set yourselves up. I just gave you the space to show everyone who you really are. The judge looked like she had aged 5 years in 5 minutes. This courtroom has procedures. This is irregular. No, Your Honor, the agent interrupted. What's irregular is what's been allowed to happen here. What's been normalized. That ends today. The room was no longer a courtroom. It was a stage, and the curtain had just fallen on the first act. Reporters had begun to arrive, tipped off anonymously moments before the reveal. Cameras clicked. A few flashes went off. Danielle didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed fixed on the men who had dragged her into court, who had mocked her humanity. They were shrinking before her, their bodies rigid, their faces drained of the smug confidence they once wore like armor. "Do you know what it feels like?" Danielle began, her voice lower now, not for the courtroom but for them. "To be treated like you're invisible? To be spoken about like you're less than garbage? I do. And I made sure every second of it counted." Daniels tried to step forward again, but the second federal agent raised a hand. "I'd stay where you are, officer. You're being placed under federal review, effective immediately. You'll be escorted out of here as soon as we're done." Danielle picked up the coat she'd left on the defense table. She folded it slowly, with care, as if honoring the role she had played, not just the disguise, but the lives of those who wore that coat in real life. People without badges, without protection, people who weren't pretending. As officers from Internal Affairs entered to begin the formal arrest and suspension procedures, Daniels called out one last time. "You think this changes anything? You think anyone cares?" Danielle looked at him, not with rage, not with triumph, but with truth. "Yes, I do. And more importantly, now they can't ignore it." And the room just watched. Watched as the powerless became powerful. Watched as a badge hidden in rags became a sword of justice. Watched as silence turned into a reckoning. But what no one knew yet was that this courtroom revelation was just the beginning. What Danielle had uncovered went far beyond Daniels and Meeks, far beyond the West Precinct. And what she was about to reveal next would shake the city to its core. Expanded narrative, continuing from where the original text left off. Daniels sat in the cold interrogation room on the 9th floor of the federal building, the fluorescent light above him flickering faintly, casting sharp shadows across his face. His badge was gone. His service weapon, his ID, all stripped from him within the last 2 hours. He was still in uniform, but now it clung to him like a costume on a man who no longer belonged to the role. His eyes were bloodshot, lips dry, hands trembling just enough to betray the rage boiling underneath the surface. Across from him sat Agent Moreno, composed, expressionless, a tape recorder already spinning on the table between them. Danielle stood to the side, arms crossed, her stare fixed and calm. But beneath her exterior was a storm, one held steady not by satisfaction, but by discipline. She wasn't here for revenge. She was here for the truth to live in daylight, unflinching. Daniels tried to smile, tried to find some piece of the bravado he'd carried like a shield his entire career. "So, this is what you do? Send in one of your own like a goddamn rat, pretending to be homeless, to trap good cops." Moreno didn't blink. "You're not here to question our strategy, officer. You're here because your actions and your words exposed you." Danielle leaned forward slightly, her voice quiet but firm. "You didn't need help to fall, Daniels. All I did was give you space. You filled the rest." Daniels leaned back in his chair, jaw tightening. "You don't know what it's like out there, dealing with the same trash every day. The same liars, addicts, thieves. We do what we have to." Danielle's tone hardened. "What you have to? Is that what you told yourself when you slammed Trina Harris into the side of a squad car for not moving fast enough? When you laughed about putting a muzzle on me in open court?" Daniels opened his mouth, but nothing came out. He turned to Moreno instead. "She baited us. She wanted us to react. She gave you nothing," Moreno said flatly. "And yet, you still showed exactly who you are." Meanwhile, back at the courthouse, reporters circled like sharks, cameras flashing, microphones pointed at any official willing to speak. The city was buzzing with the story. A high-ranking FBI agent going undercover as an unhoused woman and uncovering systemic abuse in a major police precinct wasn't just shocking, it was explosive. The footage Danielle had gathered had been released to the public by midday, Not through press conferences or official memos, but through a raw, unfiltered broadcast aired across independent news platforms. Her mic had captured everything: the arrogance, the threats, the laughter, the violence. No spin, no edits, just the truth, loud and raw and impossible to ignore. Inside the federal conference room, a small group of officers who had worked with Danielle before the operation sat silently, watching the footage play on a mounted screen. Some of them wiped their eyes, others looked away. They had known her as a colleague, a sharp and driven agent. But none of them had known what she'd sacrificed to pull this off. Her health, her safety, her peace. And now that it was public, there was no going back. Danielle, later that evening, stood in front of the city civilian review board, not to testify, not yet, but to speak directly to them as a citizen and as a professional. Her voice carried the weight of experience, of nights spent in cold alleyways, of days spent being invisible. What I witnessed wasn't just misconduct, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. It was a culture. A belief system that allowed some officers to dehumanize the very people they swore to protect because they knew no one would stop them. One board member, a gray-haired woman with soft eyes and a history in civil rights law, leaned forward. "And what do you think needs to happen now?" Danielle looked around the room, slowly, deliberately. Not just arrests, not just suspensions. That's the surface. This has to be structural. New training isn't enough. There has to be oversight from people who aren't wearing the same uniforms. There has to be accountability that isn't just internal. Across the city, reactions were mixed, as expected. Some praised her bravery, calling her a hero. Others accused her of entrapment, of targeting hardworking cops. But what couldn't be denied anymore was the footage. The evidence, the faces of those who had laughed at her, they weren't nameless anymore. They were visible. They were exposed. Meeks, now in a separate holding cell, had broken down during questioning, not with tears, but with silence, a kind of stunned, hollow quiet. He had asked for a lawyer, then asked if Danielle was watching. The agent who debriefed him said, "She doesn't need to watch. You already said enough." Back at the bureau, Danielle finally took a moment alone in her office. Her desk was still covered in old files and case notes. A photo of her mother rested in the corner. She sat in silence, looking at it, eyes softening. She had avoided this moment for days, the moment where the mask fully came off, and she was just Danielle again. Not the agent, not the disguise, just her. She whispered softly, "I did it, Ma. I made them see." Her phone buzzed. A message from Moreno. "City Council is calling for a full hearing. They want you there." She stared at the screen, then typed back, "Let's finish what we started." Meanwhile, in a quiet part of the precinct, a rookie officer, Officer Hall, sat with his head in his hands. He had seen what happened. He had been in the room during one of the incidents Danielle had recorded, but he hadn't spoken up. Fear had kept him quiet. Now, watching her unravel an entire system alone, guilt had begun to eat away at him. He walked into his supervisor's office, a trembling hand gripping his statement. "I need to talk," he said. "About what I saw." That night, as the city skyline lit up under the early evening haze, a press conference was held outside City Hall. Danielle stood to the side while the mayor, red-faced and carefully worded, tried to assure the public that justice was being served. But no one really looked at him. The cameras were on her. The questions were for her. And when the time came, she stepped forward, unflinching. "I didn't do this to become a symbol," she said, her voice calm and sharp against the echo of the microphones. "I did this because people in this city deserve to walk without fear, because no one should have to wonder if calling the police will make them less safe. And because silence has never saved anyone." From the back of the crowd, a voice called out, "Would you do it again?" She paused for a second, then nodded. "Yes, 100 times." And in that moment, surrounded by reporters, officers, city officials, and ordinary people, Danielle Brooks, once mocked, once erased, became the voice of a city trying to wake up. But beneath all of it, one truth still lingered, quiet but unshakable. There were still more names, still more officers, still more pain. And Danielle had only just begun. The days that followed were anything but quiet. The city pulsed with tension as the fallout of Danielle's reveal spread far beyond the courtroom, rippling through the precinct, the mayor's office, and the community like a wave no one had truly anticipated. News anchors debated whether her operation crossed ethical lines, while civil rights groups praised the raw bravery of exposing a machine that had long operated in the shadows. Internally, the Bureau launched parallel investigations into all officers associated with the precinct. And though several were immediately suspended, the deeper probe uncovered patterns that pointed to systemic complicity. Danielle found herself not only at the center of a legal storm, but also at the heart of a moral one. The city wanted answers, but it also wanted accountability, and some of it wanted blood. Behind the scenes, things were even more volatile. A group of officers, mostly young recruits and mid-level staff, requested a private meeting with Danielle. When she entered the conference room, there was a silence that felt almost sacred. These were the ones who had stayed quiet for too long. Officer Hall, the rookie who had come forward, sat closest to the head of the table. He looked up at her with a mixture of shame and hope. One of the others, a Latina officer named Rivera, finally broke the silence. "We knew something was wrong. We heard the jokes. We saw how some people acted, but nobody said anything. We didn't know how. And after what you did, we don't have an excuse anymore." Danielle didn't respond right away. She took her time, letting the weight of the moment settle into the room. "You had the power to speak," she finally said. "But you were afraid of the cost. I understand that. I lived that. But understand this too. Silence doesn't just protect the guilty. It abandons the innocent." Rivera's voice cracked as she replied, "So what do we do now?" Danielle looked around the room into every pair of eyes. "You tell the truth. You write the statements. You show up. You stand in front of the people who trusted you and you say, 'We failed you, but we won't do it again.'" That's how it starts. While those within the department struggled with their own reflection, the community reacted with even more complexity. Protests began to grow no longer just against the named officers, but against the structure that had allowed them to operate unchecked. Signs reading "We see you now" and "Justice wears many faces" appeared on city buildings. But so did graffiti branding Danielle as a traitor, an infiltrator who had used deception to expose what others had tried to fix from within. The city was divided. And for Danielle, that divide became more personal than she expected. At a small cafe just off North Avenue, she met with Trina Harris again. Trina's face still bore faint bruises, and the anxiety in her eyes hadn't faded. But she held herself differently now, like someone who had finally been heard. Over coffee, they sat in silence for a few minutes before Trina finally spoke. "I used to think people like you didn't care. That once you wore a badge, you couldn't feel anything for people like me." Danielle stirred her cup slowly. "Some don't. But that's why I had to do it the way I did." Trina nodded, then looked up. "But now they're coming after you, right? I've been hearing things on the street. They're saying some folks think you betrayed your own." Danielle didn't flinch. "I didn't betray anyone. I exposed the truth. If that makes people uncomfortable, then maybe they were never standing on the right side to begin with." Trina leaned forward, voice lower. "Yeah, but you know how the city is. People love you one minute, then blame you the next. You did something no one else would even dare, and now you're the one walking around with a target on your back." Danielle met her gaze. "Maybe that's the price. But I'm not afraid of being the target. I'm afraid of what happens if no one ever pulls the trigger on change." Meanwhile, the legal consequences began to take shape. The district attorney, facing mounting public pressure, announced a full review of every case prosecuted involving Daniels and Meeks. Already, defense attorneys were filing motions for retrials. And for some, Justice now meant finally being seen, not as criminals, but as people failed by the system. The court calendar swelled with reopening dates. Judges scrambled to justify years of rulings, and the mayor, under siege from all sides, attempted damage control through press conferences and policy promises that no longer satisfied anyone. Inside her own agency, Danielle faced another kind of pressure. Some of her colleagues praised her ingenuity and grit. Others, behind closed doors, whispered that she had gone rogue. There were meetings she was no longer invited to, emails that went unreturned. Moreno defended her fiercely, but even he could see the shift in the air. The agency didn't like surprises, even when those surprises led to justice. One evening, he called her into his office and closed the door behind him. "They're reviewing the operation," he said, not looking at her directly. She stood there for a moment, processing. "Reviewing? What exactly are they reviewing, the success?" He exhaled. "No one's questioning your results, Danielle. They're questioning the method. Some feel you blurred the line between agent and activist." Her eyes narrowed. "So, they're more concerned with optics than with the fact that I blew open a network of corruption inside a major precinct?" Moreno finally looked up. "You know how this works. You shook the system, and the system doesn't like being shaken." She sat across from him. "I didn't join the bureau to make it comfortable. I joined to make it accountable." He nodded slowly. "Then prepare for a fight." In the weeks that followed, Danielle continued to testify before committees, meet with community leaders, and work with internal affairs on the wider investigation. But behind every step forward was a shadow of consequence. Her name became a lightning rod. Her face, once anonymous, was now known citywide. She couldn't walk through her old neighborhood without someone stopping her to say thank you, or someone else staring at her with cold disapproval. Children pointed to her on the street. Strangers sent letters, some of gratitude, others laced with threats. One night, alone in her apartment, she sat with her brother, Jalen. He had flown in from Chicago after watching the footage of her reveal. The siblings sat on the balcony, staring out at the city's skyline. "You did something," Jalen said, his voice low. "Something big." She looked over at him. "Yeah, and now everything's different." "Is it better?" She didn't answer right away. "It's louder. People are talking." "That's a start." He nodded. "But you're not done." "No," she said. "I'm not done." And yet, inside her, a new weight had begun to settle. Not regret, but a recognition of the cost. The pain she had walked through wasn't just her own anymore. It had become part of the city's reckoning, and in doing so, it had marked her. She was no longer just Danielle. She was a symbol, and symbols don't get to rest. Still, she moved forward, every day, one meeting, one statement, one step at a time. Because even though the courtroom had erupted and the masks had fallen, the deeper work had just begun. And in the quiet moments, when the cameras were off and the streets were still, she asked herself the hardest question of all. If change demands sacrifice, how much more was she willing to give? The wind swept through the narrow streets of West Baltimore, whistling through the alleyways that Danielle had once called her temporary home during the Undercover operation. Now, she walked those same streets in plain clothes. No badge in sight, no FBI backup trailing her, no wires hidden in her coat. But every step felt heavier than before, not from fear or regret, but from the growing weight of responsibility that her choices had created. She had ignited a fire in the heart of a city already simmering with decades of pain and mistrust. Now, she could feel the burn in every conversation, every eye that lingered too long on her as she passed. Some people nodded to her with quiet respect. Others crossed the street. Some stared like she was a stranger wearing a mask of someone they thought they knew. What she had done wasn't just a disruption. It was a shift. And the ground still hadn't settled beneath it. She met with the community coalition that evening in a small basement church room, the same room where activists, Public defenders, pastors, and former victims of the justice system had gathered long before her name was in headlines. The energy was tense, divided, complicated. Some in the room had welcomed the exposure she brought. Others, especially those who had fought for years to build cautious bridges with the police, viewed her operation as reckless, even dangerous. They believed her method, going undercover, staging her arrest, deceiving both the public and the department, had placed their delicate progress at risk. Danielle sat near the front of the room, listening, not speaking yet. A man named Kareem, an elder in the community and a former organizer from the civil rights era, finally stood and addressed her directly. "You came in like a storm," he said, his voice rough but steady. "And sometimes a storm clears the air. But other times, it tears the roof off the house before you got a plan to rebuild it." Danielle looked at him with the calm of someone who understood the layers of pain behind those words. "I didn't come here to tear anything down that wasn't already broken," she said. "I came because too many people were already living under a roof that was caving in and calling it shelter." A younger woman, Nia, who had been organizing mutual aid for the houseless population for years, leaned forward in her chair. "You could have talked to us. You could have warned somebody. Instead, you made a move and left the rest of us to deal with the shockwaves. People are scared. Cops are retaliating. Trust is paper-thin right now." Danielle nodded slowly, her hands clasped tightly together. "I didn't make this move alone. The FBI greenlit the operation. But you're right. The community wasn't brought in, and that's on me. I made a call to stay silent for the integrity of the case. But I hear you. I do. And I take that weight with me every day." Kareem softened his gaze, but didn't ease up. "Now that the curtain's been pulled back, what do you plan to do with the stage you've been given?" Danielle's voice didn't rise, but it deepened. "Use it. Not for speeches, not for saving face, but for policy, reform, oversight. I didn't just uncover abuse. I documented a failure of accountability. And I won't walk away until there's something real in its place. Something that won't collapse the moment a camera is turned off." That answer sat in the room like smoke, lingering, unsettling, but impossible to ignore. Nia looked at her again, less guarded now. "If you're serious, you'll come to the next city council session and stand with us when we demand community-led review boards." Danielle nodded without hesitation. "I'll be there." The room didn't erupt into applause. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a battlefield meeting in the middle of a war that had only begun to change direction, but it was something. A step. Later that week, Danielle found herself back at FBI headquarters, this time on the other side of the conference table. A formal review board had been convened to evaluate the legality, ethics, and impact of her operation. It wasn't a trial, but it wasn't far from one either. She sat across from 5 agents, 2 legal advisors, and a representative from the Department of Justice, all of whom had reviewed the hours of footage, transcripts, and internal memos related to Operation Ghost Watch. The lead advisor, Agent Winslow, adjusted his glasses as he began to speak. "Agent Brooks, while the Bureau acknowledges the success of your undercover operation and the subsequent legal action now underway against the West Precinct, concerns have been raised regarding procedural overreach and the risk of agent endangerment without sufficient backup. Furthermore, questions remain about your discretionary judgment in withholding operational details from both field offices and community organizations. Do you have a formal statement before this panel proceeds with their findings?" Danielle took a breath, steadying her voice. "I operated under the direct approval of Assistant Director Moreno. My methods were unorthodox, yes, but every protocol deviation was recorded and justified in real time to preserve the integrity of the investigation. As for withholding information from external entities, I had to make a choice between transparency and exposure. Had I revealed my presence to the community or the department prematurely, the operation would have been compromised, and frankly, I wouldn't be sitting here testifying to its success." One of the legal advisors leaned in. "Agent Brooks, your decision placed you in serious physical danger." There were multiple nights when you could have been severely harmed or killed. Why not pull the plug earlier? Her eyes didn't flinch. Because the abuse didn't stop at the first sign of pressure. It wasn't isolated. I had to stay long enough to show that it wasn't a few bad apples. It was the soil. The panel went quiet for a long moment. Winslow eventually closed his folder. Your testimony is on record. We'll conclude this review by end of week. You are not suspended pending decision, but we strongly advise against further independent action. Danielle stood, nodded, and exited the room with the slow calm of someone used to navigating rooms not designed to hold her. That evening, she returned to her old neighborhood, not undercover, not for a case, but for herself. She walked past the corner store where Jalen had been assaulted years ago, the same one whose security camera had been mysteriously malfunctioning that night. It had taken her all this time to turn pain into purpose. And even now, with headlines spinning and city officials scrambling, it still didn't feel like enough. She stopped when she saw a group of kids playing basketball with a rusted hoop nailed to a wooden post. One of them looked over, eyes wide, then ran over and called to the others, "That's her. That's the woman from TV." They swarmed her with questions. Some asked if she was a real FBI agent. Others wanted to know how she could pretend to be homeless. But one boy, maybe 9 or 10, stood back a little and asked quietly, "Did it hurt when they treated you like that?" Danielle crouched down, meeting his eyes. "Yeah, it hurt a lot. But that's why I did it. So maybe one day, you won't have to be afraid of people in uniform." He nodded slowly, then reached out and held her hand for just a second. That small gesture, quiet, sincere, hit her harder than any applause or award ever could. As she walked back toward her car, the city skyline in the distance flickering under the weight of streetlights and sirens, Danielle knew this wasn't the end of her journey. The operation was over. The investigation was underway. But the real work, changing hearts, rebuilding trust, unlearning fear, would take years, maybe even a lifetime. But she was still standing, and she was still ready. It was nearly midnight when Danielle found herself alone inside the quiet walls of the old municipal archive building downtown. She hadn't meant to be there this late, but something about the silence, the hum of the fluorescent lights above the rows of dusty case files, had a strange kind of comfort to it. The world outside was still loud, still burning with the aftermath of her actions, still debating her methods, still trying to reconcile the fact that a black woman who once walked the streets as nobody had brought down a wall that had been standing for decades. But in here, there was only the truth, paperwork, forgotten testimonies, cases shelved under bureaucracy, lives lost between the lines of what was documented and what was erased. Danielle had come searching for something that had haunted her for years, the original internal affairs report on her brother's incident. It had disappeared back then. No follow-up, no inquiry, no justice. But she believed now that it wasn't just negligence. It was deliberate. And she needed to see it with her own eyes. Her fingers moved carefully across the brittle tabs, tracing the years like they were scars. She pulled a box marked 2008, slid out the thick envelope labeled Use of Force, West Precinct, and flipped it open. Inside, among routine reports and vague statements, she found it, the page she'd visualized 100 times in her memory. Asterisk Jalen Brooks, date of incident. Witness statements redacted. Injuries consistent with blunt trauma. Officers involved, Meeks, Daniels. Asterisk her throat tightened for a moment. Everything around her disappeared. All the noise, all the applause, all the anger, gone. Just that page and the unbearable weight of knowing it had always been them. The men who had joked about her in court. The men who had called her garbage without knowing she was their reckoning in disguise. They hadn't just violated others. They had started with her family. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her. A text from Moreno. Final DOJ statement comes out tomorrow morning. We need to prep. She replied simply, I'm ready. But deep down, she wasn't sure what readiness looked like anymore. She had been running on purpose for so long, she hadn't stopped to ask herself what would be left when the mission ended. When the disguises were gone, the cameras faded, the reports written. Who was she then? Just a woman with too many truths and a city full of people still deciding whether to thank her or blame her. The next morning, Danielle stood in a long, high-ceilinged hall at the Justice Department, waiting to be called into a closed-door meeting with senior legal staff and federal prosecutors. Moreno stood beside her, briefcase in hand, his suit sharp, but his expression worn. "There's pushback," he said quietly. "Some of the DC brass feel the operation compromised federal neutrality in community matters. They're worried you've become too visible." Danielle raised an eyebrow. "Too visible for doing the job they gave me?" Moreno gave a half-shrug, the kind that said more than words. "This isn't about what's right. It's about what they can control." She exhaled, adjusting the collar of her jacket. "Then let them try. I didn't come this far to apologize for forcing people to look." Inside the room, the tone was all cold professionalism. A row of officials sat across from her, folders in front of them, language carefully curated to sound fair but non-committal. They reviewed the data, asked procedural questions, brought up public reactions, federal liability, and departmental image. But one woman, Assistant Deputy Langston, leaned forward midway through the meeting and spoke in a voice that carried a different weight. "Agent Brooks, I've read every page of your field notes, every recording, every transcript. And while some of my colleagues are nervous about the blowback, I want to say something plainly. What you did exposed something no audit, no task force, no annual review ever could. You didn't just pull back the curtain. You made people look into the mirror." Danielle met her gaze. "That was the point." "It always was." Langston nodded slowly, then turned to the rest of the board. "Whatever else happens here today, let the record show that this agent demonstrated the courage our system claims to stand for." After the meeting, as the sun began to sink behind the Washington skyline, Danielle returned to Baltimore for what would be the most emotional moment yet. Meeting the families, not just those of recent victims, but the ones whose cases had never been opened, never received attention. Mothers, sons, grandfathers, sisters, all carrying pain wrapped in silence. The Bureau had organized the meeting as part of the department's effort to rebuild trust. But to Danielle, this wasn't policy. This was personal. The community center gym was filled with folding chairs and a heavy sense of anticipation. People looked at her, not with awe, but with expectation. She stood at the front, took the microphone, and paused. Then, with the raw honesty that had defined her journey, she spoke. "I know some of you are still hurting. I know many of you are tired of speeches and promises. I'm not here to give you either. I'm here because I've seen what you've been living through. I've felt it. And I came back to tell you, not everything is fixed. Not yet. But the silence is broken. And that's where change begins." From the crowd, a woman stood, older, with a worn face and eyes that carried years of buried grief. "My son was arrested 5 years ago. He never came home. They said it was an overdose, but I never got to see the report. Can you help me find the truth?" Danielle's voice broke slightly as she replied, "Yes. I will help you. I can't promise you justice overnight, but I can promise you won't be ignored again." After the gathering, as people filtered out with cautious hope, Danielle was approached by Officer Hall. He looked different. The same uniform, but a different presence. Humble, purposeful. "I submitted my resignation," he said quietly. "But not because I'm quitting. I want to work from the outside. Help rebuild what's broken. I owe you that." Danielle placed a hand on his shoulder. "You owe that to yourself, and to the people you serve next." As the week drew to a close, the city began to shift. Slowly, the DOJ released its report, validating Danielle's findings, outlining systemic abuses, and recommending a full restructuring of the West Precinct. A new task force was formed, half federal agents, half civilians. Community oversight boards gained legal approval, and officers implicated in misconduct began to see real consequences. Some were prosecuted, others barred from future service. But more than that, something deeper had changed. People who had never dared to speak now stepped forward. Victims, witnesses, allies, they began sharing their stories, not just in private, but publicly, loudly, defiantly. And through it all, Danielle stayed, not as a symbol, not as a savior, but as someone who had once been invisible and chose never to be again. In her apartment, alone once more, she stood by the window as rain traced paths down the glass. The city stretched out before her, complicated, wounded, and alive. Behind her, on the table, sat a letter, an offer from the Bureau to lead a new initiative focused on undercover reform. It was an opportunity to take her experience and build something lasting. But she hadn't answered yet because she knew that what came next wasn't just about where she worked. It was about who she chose to be now. And as lightning flickered in the distance and thunder rolled low over the street, she whispered into the quiet room, not to herself, but to every person still waiting to be seen, "I see you. I'm not done." Months passed, and Baltimore slowly began to look and feel like a different city. Not because the problems had disappeared, they hadn't, but because the silence had finally been pierced, and people no longer looked away. Danielle Brooks became something more than just a name tied to a federal operation. Her image wasn't splashed across billboards or magazines, but it lived in the minds of those who had once felt voiceless. She turned down the Bureau's offer to lead their reform task force, not out of defiance, but because she realized change from the inside had its limits. Instead, she took a role that allowed her to work on the ground level as director of a newly formed Civilian Justice Alliance, an independent body of investigators, social workers, legal experts, and activists. Funded in part by settlements won from exposed misconduct cases, the Alliance operated without badges, without sirens, only truth, accountability, and a promise to never let another voice go unheard again. Officer Hall, no longer in uniform, returned to the streets, not as law enforcement, but as a liaison between neighborhoods and public service boards. His resignation didn't mark defeat, but rebirth. He went door to door, listening, learning, rebuilding trust in places where uniforms had only ever brought fear. He wasn't celebrated like Danielle, but in quiet moments, like when a mother opened her door to ask where she could get help for her son's wrongful arrest, or when a teenager finally agreed to testify after years of silence, he felt something real, something earned. He never forgot the woman who stood against everything he had once been afraid to name. And now, every act of courage he performed was a silent vow to honor her. Kareem passed away 3 months after the reform hearings. His heart had grown tired after a lifetime of fighting, but he passed knowing the city was finally bending, even if slowly, toward justice. At his funeral, Danielle stood at the back, silent tears on her cheeks. He had been a mentor in a moment when she most needed to be grounded, to be reminded that change doesn't happen through noise alone, but through persistence. She remembered his words, "Storms can clear the air or tear off the roof." And she understood now that she had done both. And in doing so, she'd given space for something new to be built. Trina Harris found stability. With the help of outreach programs connected to the Alliance, she received housing, therapy, and, for the first time in years, a sense of safety. She began volunteering with youth shelters, speaking not as a victim, but as a survivor who had seen the worst and lived. One day, she walked into Danielle's office, dressed clean, eyes steady, and placed a small card on her desk. "Just wanted to say thank you," she said softly. "Not just for what you did for the city, but for not looking through me like everyone else did." Danielle looked at the card. It was hand-drawn, a sun breaking through gray clouds. She smiled. "You made your own light, Trina. I just moved the shadows." As for Daniels and Meeks, the city did not forget them. Both were indicted following the DOJ report. Daniels was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison for obstruction of justice, falsifying reports, and multiple counts of civil rights violations. Meeks took a plea deal, his sentence lighter, but his name permanently attached to a legacy of abuse. There were no dramatic endings for them, no redemption arcs, just the slow, inevitable consequence of choices made in the dark. In the final court hearing, Danielle sat quietly in the back row, not to gloat, not for closure, but to make sure no one rewrote the story. There was no misunderstanding, no misinterpretation. They had done this to themselves. In a city council meeting broadcast live across the state, Danielle delivered her final testimony as part of the investigation's public review. She stood, not behind a podium, but on the floor beside citizens who had lived the consequences. She didn't read from notes. She didn't recite statistics. She simply spoke. I did what I did because I was tired of asking nicely for the right to exist with dignity. Tired of seeing people treated like problems instead of human beings. Tired of watching justice used like a weapon against the very people it was supposed to protect. I'm not the hero in this story. The people who endured it all and still stood up, they're the ones we should be listening to. I just opened the door. The applause was quiet at first, then grew louder. But Danielle didn't bask in it. She left the room the same way she'd entered, quietly, with purpose. And 1 year later, almost to the day, she stood again in front of that same courthouse where it had all started. Not as a defendant, not as an agent, but as a speaker at the opening of the city's first publicly funded legal advocacy center for victims of police misconduct. The building was modest, but inside were offices, caseworkers, trauma counselors, and investigators trained to pursue justice without fear or favor. A mural covered the outside wall, not of Danielle's face, but of raised hands linked together, reaching toward a skyline of hope. Above it, in bold paint, were words that stopped every passerby. Asterisk, we were never invisible. You just weren't looking. Asterisk. Danielle stood beneath it, her heart full, her mind quiet. She didn't need applause. She didn't need headlines. She had the truth. And that was enough. But what happens when the truth isn't enough? The city had changed, but not entirely. Pockets of resistance remained, officers who clung to old ways, politicians who prioritized optics over reform, communities still fractured by mistrust. Danielle knew this, and it fueled her. The Civilian Justice Alliance grew, opening satellite offices in other cities, training new advocates, and amplifying voices that had been ignored for too long. She became a mentor to young activists, a confidant to survivors, and a thorn in the side of those who preferred the status quo. One evening, as she walked through a park where she used to play as a child, she saw a group of teenagers gathered around a makeshift memorial for a young man killed by police years earlier. The candles were fresh, the flowers new. One of the teens, a girl with braids and a determined look, approached her. "You're Danielle Brooks, right?" she asked. Danielle nodded. "I saw you on TV. You made them listen. How do we do that?" Danielle paused, then knelt beside the memorial. "You start by remembering. You keep showing up. You tell your story, even when they don't want to hear it. And you never let them forget who you're fighting for." The girl nodded, her eyes fierce. "We won't." That night, back in her apartment, Danielle sat at her desk, a stack of case files from the Alliance waiting for her attention. Her phone buzzed with a message from Nia, the activist from the Community Coalition. Asterisk City Council just approved funding for 3 more oversight boards. "You were right. It's not over." Asterisk Danielle smiled faintly, then turned to the window. The city was still there, still breathing, still fighting. And so was she. But the fight was far from finished. Danielle began receiving reports of retaliation against whistleblowers within the precinct, officers who had come forward after her operation were being ostracized, demoted, or pushed out. She worked with the Alliance to provide legal support, but the pushback was fierce. One night, a brick was thrown through the window of the Alliance's main office, with a note attached, You can't change what's always been. Danielle held the note in her hand, her jaw tight. She didn't flinch. Instead, she called a meeting with her team the next morning. They think they can scare us, she said, holding up the note. But fear only works if you let it. We keep going. We protect our people. We build stronger. The Alliance responded by launching a public campaign, sharing stories of retaliation and demanding protections for whistleblowers. The campaign gained traction, with national media picking up the story. Protests swelled again, this time with a new chant: "No more silence, no more fear." Danielle stood at the front of one march, not as a leader, but as one of many, her voice blending with the crowd. She knew the risks were growing. Her name was now a target for those who wanted the old system to survive. But she also knew something they didn't. The people she fought for were no longer invisible. They were awake, and they were loud. Years later, Danielle's legacy was not in the headlines, but in the lives she touched. The Legal Advocacy Center expanded, becoming a model for other cities. The Civilian Justice Alliance trained hundreds of advocates, many of whom were survivors of injustice themselves. Trina became a full-time counselor, helping others find the stability she had fought for. Officer Hall founded a nonprofit that connected at-risk youth with mentors, keeping them away from the streets that had once claimed so many. And the city, though still imperfect, was no longer the same. Trust was being rebuilt, one conversation, one policy, one truth at a time. Danielle, now in her early 40s, stood on a stage at a national conference on criminal justice reform. The room was filled with policymakers, activists, and survivors. She looked out at the crowd, her voice steady but warm. Justice isn't a moment. It's a movement. It's not about one person or one case. It's about what we do every day to make sure no one is invisible again. I didn't start this fight, and I won't finish it. But I'll carry it as long as I'm here. The applause was deafening, but Danielle's eyes were on the back of the room, where a young woman stood, holding a sign that read, "We see you now." As she stepped off the stage, a reporter asked her, "What's next for Danielle Brooks?" She smiled, a quiet fire in her eyes. What's next is what's always been. The work, the truth, the people. And with that, she walked away, back into the city that had shaped her, back into the fight that defined her, back into the light she had helped create. Here the story ends, and hope you like it, so please subscribe our channel. Thank you.